Michael Walzer is one of this country's foremost political theorists. He was a professor of government at Harvard University earlier in his career and was later named UPS Foundation Professor of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He's the co-editor of Dissent and author or editor of many major books, including The Revolution of the Saints, Just and Unjust Wars, Spheres of Justice, Exodus and Revolution on Toleration, and The Company of Critics. When, quite some time ago, but immediately after it had first appeared in print, I read the book by Professor Walzer entitled Obligations, I remember being struck by the fact that that work's epigraph was in Hebrew. Not trusting my knowledge of the language, though I had actually studied it as a kid, I promptly tracked down a reliable English translation of the work from which that epigraph was taken and found that the relevant passage, when translated into English, read, "Can two walk together except if they have so agreed?" Professor Walzer's book dealt with altogether different issues. Nevertheless, I dare say that the question raised by that epigraph is, in some ways at least, our question here today as well. I'm deeply honored to present Professor Michael Walzer.
Thank you, Jack. I was very grateful this morning to Ronald Bradush, who exempted Mitchell Cohen and me from his critique of the anti-Zionist left, but I was sad to hear that we have no influence. Actually, it's the influence question isn't up to Ron, and it isn't up to Mitchell and me either. It's up to you. So let's see how much I can influence you this afternoon. I'm going to talk about, I thought this was right for a keynote, I'm going to talk about a subject that comes first in the story of Jewish leftism, both logically and chronologically. My subject is the difficult, problematic relation of Jewish leftism to the religion of the Jews. So I'm starting before the arguments that we've had so far today. I'm starting a different argument. We leftists began from the religious world. There was no other place, and it can't have been an easy beginning. Now, many people have pretended that it was easy. They try to find reasons for the Jewish predilection for left politics in Judaism itself. Pesach as a celebration of national liberation, Hanukkah as a celebration of religious freedom, the prophets as social critics and advocates of social justice, tzedakah as a commitment to the most vulnerable members of society. Now, there's something to say in favor of this view of our religion, but not enough to explain Jewish leftism. Certainly the holidays, in their Orthodox versions, carry a message very different from the one we were taught in Reform and liberal left households. Pesach celebrates the liberation at the hand of God and God alone. The people of Israel did nothing to free themselves. This was a liberation without human agency, which is the absolutely essential feature of any left politics, of any politics, actually. And the leaders of the Maccabean Revolt were religious zealots. They were opposed, indeed, to the imposition of an imperial Hellenistic religion. They fought for the freedom to impose their own orthodoxy on their own people. They were closer in spirit, I dare say, to the Taliban than to the labor Zionists. The prophets in the texts we love to quote were magnificent social critics and advocates of social justice, but there are many texts that we don't love to quote. And the practice of tzedakah and the old kehilot, which certainly made for a kind of welfareism that I will talk about later, did not interfere at all with the oligarchies that ruled in each kahal. In fact, traditional Judaism offers precious little support to a left politics. Hence the strangeness of Jewish leftism, for which centuries of religious life did not prepare us. There is no straight line from Judaism to left politics. Those of you who grew up believing, as I did, that Judaism and socialism are pretty much the same thing may find this surprising. But you know, if not in your heart of hearts, then in your mind of minds, that it is true. The negation of the exile, which is really a negation of traditional Judaism, the religion of the exile, is not only central to Zionism, it is central to leftism also. Small numbers of Jews may have moved into a kind of left politics through the experience of religious heresy, as some recent scholars have told us about the Frankists. But leftism on a larger scale is a product of the radical break that emancipation made possible, beginning in the French Revolution and continuing through the 19th century. Emancipation didn't only bring us into the modern state, it also brought us out of the traditional kahal. It freed us from the rule of the rabbis. It opened the way to citizenship and political engagement. We need to recognize this so that we can recognize and resist the return of the negated. For Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Judaism in Israel today, and in the United States also, is experiencing an extraordinary revival, and it is a powerfully conservative, right-wing, often far-right political force. I don't mean that all Orthodox Jews or ultra-Orthodox Jews are right-wing. That's clearly not true. But the tendency of their collective commitments is steadily rightward. Many of us find the strength of the tendency surprising, but again, it really isn't. At least it's no more surprising than the politics of Christian fundamentalism or Islamic zealotry or Hindu nationalism. For decades, we were taught that secularization was an irresistible historical tendency. That was an academic theory that was picked up with enthusiasm by political activists. David Ben-Gurion certainly believed it. When he made his deal with the ultra-Orthodox sects, he imagined a future Jewish state in which they would be like the Amish or the Mennonites in the United States. Today, this irresistible tendency toward secularization is being resisted with considerable success. It turns out that a secular and liberal left politics requires a commitment to the long term. We are still engaged in the political and ideological struggles that began more than 200 years ago. What I would like to do this afternoon is to address 6 features of traditional Judaism that militate against a left politics. Now, there are features that militate in favor of a left politics. I've discussed them in other places. My subject today is these 6 that move in the other direction. The 6 are not entirely distinct. They overlap in various ways, and the list is not exhaustive. Many of you may want to add to it. But it will at least suggest what we on the Jewish left are up against. First, the idea of the chosen people. We all know the many ways liberal and leftist Jews have dealt with the embarrassment of chosenness. They say that we aren't the chosen people, we are the choosing people. And in any case, all that we were chosen for was Soros. Or alternatively, they say that chosenness is entirely about obligation and not about privilege. Or they say that it isn't a divinely appointed status at all, but a human vocation, and every national and religious group has its own vocation. And then there is always the prophet Amos, wonderful Amos, who tells us in God's name, "To me, O Israelites, you are just like the Ethiopians." Unfortunately, Amos's line is not the dominant line in our religious tradition. And the insistence that we have a special relationship to God, that he loves us more than he does any other human group, however little he does to show his love, that insistence has sometimes taken very ugly and chauvinist forms. Though the Bible says explicitly that we weren't chosen for any qualities of our own, many Jewish writers have looked for and laid claim to qualities that might justify God's choice. And the claims extend from our spiritual insight and our elevated morality to some kind of ontological superiority, such that Jewish lives are reckoned by some of our rabbis to be more valuable than non-Jewish lives in wartime calculations and whenever triage is necessary. The biblical covenant seems to imply that all Jews are each other's equals. But in many traditional Jewish texts, it's obvious that equality does not extend to individuals and nations outside the covenant. That all men and women are created in God's image is a biblical, therefore a Jewish idea. And it serves as a wonderful metaphor for leftist egalitarianism, even for leftists who don't believe in God. In rabbinic times, this idea seems to have provided the grounds for a rejection of capital punishment and also of mutilation as a punishment, since both of these required an assault on, a violation of, God's image. But in truth, creation in the image played very little part in Jewish perceptions of non-Jews until the 19th century and the rise of the Reform movement. The formation of left egalitarianism required a reformation of Orthodox Judaism. The second feature of traditional Judaism that militates against the left politics is the subordination of women. Though we are all chosen, some of us are more chosen than others. In traditional Judaism, only men are chosen for service to God in the community, which also means that only men are chosen for the study of Torah and for the rabbinate. No doubt the distrust and fear of women plays a large part in Christianity and Islam also, but comparison is never an excuse. In the modern world, the Orthodox exclusion of women from public activity, both religious and political, has a double effect. It marks Judaism as inherently undemocratic, given that half of the Jewish people are denied their rightful agency, and it makes Orthodox men self-interested supporters of this denial, since it guarantees their own privileged position. Women were perhaps the greatest beneficiaries of emancipation. It freed them, or most of them, from the restraints imposed by halakhic Judaism. But this freedom was never fully realized, and it is today being contested with new energy, despite the appearance of Orthodox women who are fierce feminists. The opposition here is stark, for it is a fundamental leftist commitment, as the German Social Democrat August Bebel wrote in the 1890s, that there can be no liberation of mankind without equality of the sexes. The third feature, fear and hatred of the Goyim. You know the litany. All the world is against us. In every age, they come to destroy us. This is the perspective of exile, a galut mentality, marked above all by the fearful anticipation of hostility and then by the hatred that fear produces. There is certainly much in the history of our exile that explains the fear. But all the world against us fails to explain what has to be the decisive fact about our exile, that we have so far survived it, not only physically as individuals, obviously many individuals didn't survive, but collectively as a nation. In fact, we have always had friends, or at least patrons and protectors, as well as enemies, in every age and in every country of our exile. It is particularly irritating to hear right-wing Israelis recite the litany as if Zionism has completely failed and Israeli Jews are still a persecuted minority trapped in yet another hostile environment. In fact, again, Israel today has realized the plea of the elders to Samuel in the first book of Samuel, that they be given a king so that they could be like all the nations. The success of Zionism means that Israel is a state like all the states. It has friends. It has strategic allies who are not quite friends. It has fellow members of the Society of States who are not particularly interested one way or another. It has enemies who are of little consequence, and it has enemies who are serious indeed. The refusal to recognize this complex reality makes it difficult to engage in a creative way with the non-Jewish world. It may well be true that creative engagement wasn't possible for much of our exile. After emancipation in the West and sovereignty in the Middle East, it is certainly possible. All the world against us makes negotiations seem fruitless. It invites us not only to expect hostility, but to join in it. It justifies strident defiance and sullen passivity. Since nothing we do will make any difference, they will always hate us. And it may one day justify abject submission if we cannot any longer oppose their hatred. It leaves no room for the politics and diplomacy of liberal nationalism and internationalism. The fourth feature of our tradition, Stadlanut. Until emancipation, the everyday politics of exile, what we might think of as the foreign policy of the exilic communities, was profoundly conservative, for very good reasons. The prophet Jeremiah provides the earliest prescription for our life in exile in his letter to the transported Judeans in Babylonia. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, unto all that are carried away captive, build homes and dwell in them, and plant gardens and eat the fruit of them. Take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters, that you may be increased there and not diminished. And seek the peace of the city, whither I have caused you to be carried away captives, and pray unto the Lord for it, for in the peace thereof shall you have peace. The book of Esther illustrates this politics. Though when Jeremiah wrote, give your daughters to husbands, he probably did not have in mind the deliverance of a maidenly Esther to a heathen king. When Mordecai informed on the conspirators Bigtana and Teresh, he was seeking influence for himself in the palace, and at the same time he was following Jeremiah's advice and seeking the peace of the city, which readily translates into the security of the ruling powers. He was the first Stadlan. And it's interesting to note that he made early Zionist and leftist writers profoundly uneasy. The Yiddish writer Y.L. Peretz, who was both a Zionist and a socialist, called Mordecai the first informer and the first pimp. One of the central goals of Zionism, and Jewish leftism too, was to make court Jews like Mordecai unnecessary. Throughout our exile, we have been safest in stable states and empires ruled with a strong hand. And so the Stadlanim, the court Jews, and the communal emissaries worked not only to find favor with the king, but also to strengthen his hand. We sensibly fear populist uprisings and their charismatic leaders who fuel and feed off of popular prejudice and resentment. And so we've looked for protection to the powers that be, and we have defended the peace of the city against those who would disrupt it. This was the politics of exile. Look for a protector, make yourself useful to him, and cling to him. You can find the religious version of this politics in the prayer for the king, revised in some American Orthodox prayer books as a prayer for the president, which includes the line, "May he deal kindly with us." This hope does not reflect the mindset of a democratic citizen who might better pray in this way, "May we and our fellow citizens elect leaders who will act justly at home and in the world." But for much of our history in exile, a ruler who dealt kindly with us was the most that we could hope for. And we supported rulers of that sort, whether or not they were righteous rulers, or better, we thought them righteous if they were kind to us. And this is, again, entirely understandable. The old fearfulness and the hope for protection, together these constitute a powerful conservative force. The fifth feature, clericalism, the rule of rabbis. Jewish life in exile was almost everywhere congregationalist in form. We didn't have to learn that from the Protestants. Each kahal was a congregation which governed itself and provided welfare services to its members. It was one of the effects of statelessness that there was no central authority, no king or high priest, no Jewish pope or archbishop. But the kahal was never a democracy. After the destruction of the Second Temple, when we no longer had a state of our own and when we could not crown a king, we canonized a set of texts instead, and we were ruled by the learned men. They were always men who studied and interpreted the texts. These were the sages, and they were not entirely unlike the men who rule in Iran today, whose conservatism we have no trouble recognizing. They had, of course, lay allies who were also sometimes competitors, but they were a dominant force for much of our history. And they probably were, all things considered, better rulers than the feudal warriors and absolute monarchs of Christendom. Certainly, the rabbis of pre-emancipation Jewry were far more creative than Orthodox rabbis are today. They were capable of remarkable innovation, as when Gershom, the light of the exile, abolished polygamy in Ashkenaz with an edict that paid no attention to biblical or Talmudic precedents. Still, the rabbis were not democratic leaders. Their authority came from their learning, and they married their sons and daughters into families whose authority came from their wealth. And so there came into existence those oligarchies of merchants, bankers, and scholars that dominated Jewish communities before emancipation. Modern defenders of democracy thought they could dismiss the scholars. They had to fight the merchants and bankers. That fight goes on. We understand its dimensions. But the revival of rabbinic authority in Israel today reminds us of what traditional Judaism was really like. Orthodox rabbis claimed, and they still claim, to know the Word of God, and that gave them and gives them a power whose dimensions secular leftists have great difficulty understanding. The sixth feature, hostility to any kind of political engagement. Even in biblical times, and more strongly in the exilic years, the religion of the Israelites and then of the Jews had a strong anti-political tendency. The children of Israel were taught to trust in God. Self-help was not a biblical doctrine, though the historical books make it clear that Israelite kings like Hezekiah believed in it. Faith made politics unnecessary. So the Israelites at the Red Sea had nothing to do but stand still, as Moses told them, and watch the salvation of the Lord. In the wilderness, they did not have to find ways of feeding themselves. They didn't need a Joseph, as the Egyptians did. God provided manna for hungry Israelites. Moses did not have to look for a politics that would vindicate his authority. God acted directly to destroy all those who rebelled against him. The same faith in divine deliverance is reflected in Jewish messianism. There is nothing for human beings to do but sit and wait for the coming of the Messiah. To be sure, there were always Jews who counted the days and tried to force the end, but both these activities were condemned in the mainstream tradition. Orthodox Judaism made for political passivity, for what Gershom Scholem has called a politics of deferment. The Stadlan, of course, was supposed to be engaged, but only as an intercessor, never as an autonomous actor. The opposition of many religious Jews to Zionism followed from this commitment to wait for God to act. Opposition to revolution followed with equal, if not greater, force. For revolution was a manifest, if a secularized example, of forcing the end, which was beyond the mandate and beyond the capacity of human beings. God might make a revolution someday, but to try to anticipate God's actions was blasphemous. Why then did so many Jews become revolutionaries? Why did so many Jews join and lead left-wing parties and movements? Why did so many Jews who weren't revolutionaries gravitate toward the center left and become good liberals and social democrats? Why did so few Jews join parties of the right? There must be something in our history, if not in our religion, that pushed us leftward and that produced the negation of the exile, the radical rejection of the 6 features of traditional Judaism that I've just listed, and of much else besides. And of course, there is the history of the Jews as a pariah people, the experience of discrimination and persecution, the extreme vulnerability of Jewish communities before and after emancipation, prepared us to embrace a leftist politics which is aimed at bringing in all the pariah peoples, at ending discrimination and persecution everywhere, and at guaranteeing everyone's security. We were prepared in another way. Because of our vulnerability, the Kahal, though never a democracy, had to be a kind of welfare state. And it was obvious to everyone that in time of danger, individual wealth had to be available to the community. In this limited but important sense, we were socialists avant la lettre long before there was socialism. Similarly, the humiliations of Stadlanut and the centuries of waiting for a deliverance that never came produced Jews who were more than ready for the excitement, the hope, and even the dangers of revolution. Given our history, and for the moment disregarding traditional Judaism, our leftism wasn't so strange. Emancipated Jews were easily naturalized into left politics. And while there were anti-Semites on the left too, the universalism of leftist parties and movements seemed, and often was, genuinely welcoming. For us, left politics was both self-interested and idealistic. We were seeking benefits for ourselves, equality, integration, an end to every form of persecution, and we were also joining a cause that had universal value. Indeed, this is what leftism conventionally is like. Think of American social movements like those that advocated votes for women, unions for workers, civil rights for blacks. All these invited people to fight on their own behalf and at the same time for justice and equality generally. For Jews emerging from the ghetto, this twofold project must have seemed especially attractive. It still does seem attractive to me. But our participation in left politics required a rejection of our exilic religion. Hence the negation of the exile, which was both necessary and, I now want to argue, profoundly wrong. I mean, it was necessary to reject features of exilic Judaism, like the 6 I have listed and others too, but it was profoundly wrong to reject, as so many leftists did, the whole thing. Negation tended to be, for many of the men and women committed to it, a totalizing project. And it left them with too little cultural material with which to shape an alternative Jewish life. And then, as we see in Israel today, with too little capacity to resist a religious revival. The kitschiness of misrepresented or redesigned holidays doesn't work, or at least it doesn't work for long. Nor will carefully selected biblical texts do the job. I call Jewish leftism strange, in that our religious tradition doesn't support it and can't explain it. But left politics was strange in another sense, as in the biblical phrase, strange women, describing Solomon's foreign wives. Leftists were suddenly aliens among their own people. From a religious perspective, becoming a leftist was like moving to a foreign country. Consider the following lines written by the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz in his autobiography, Native Realm, about leftist intellectuals of Jewish origin in Poland and Lithuania in the 1920s and 30s. This is what Miłosz says. From general ideas about the equality of men, they drew the conclusion that the past does not count. They were unwilling to take an interest in Yiddish literature or to translate it into Polish because they saw it as provincial and inferior, a leftover from the ghetto, the very mention of which was a tactless blunder. If anyone mentioned the Jews in their presence, they took offense, at once reading racism into the remark. They tried at all costs to forget who they were. This is a view from the outside, harsh and profoundly accurate. It doesn't describe all Jewish leftists, obviously, but it does describe many of them. But the phrase tried to forget misses significant features of the actual work of negation. The idea that Judaism was provincial and inferior is only part of the perception that motivates the work. It is the picture of traditional Jews as passive, frightened, and deferential in the everyday world, and at the same time complacent in their faith, obedient to their rabbis, confident in a redemption for which they had nothing to do. That's what drove the negation. But putting all that behind you leaves too little in front of you. Forgetting who you were may have made you immediately a leftist militant, but it did not make for a sustainable Jewish militancy. It didn't make for a leftist culture that could be reproduced over the generations, the way traditional Judaism has been and still is reproduced. In truth, we on the Jewish left have not done well at cultural reproduction. What is necessary if we are to sustain the apolitical project that is both Jewish and leftist is something different from forgetting, different from negation. What is necessary is a critical engagement with the tradition. It has to be critical for all the reasons I started with, but it also has to be an actual engagement. What does that mean? I can only suggest a few possibilities which will make for a kind of conclusion today, though this is an argument that I hope others will continue. The critical engagement has to begin with a denial that the tradition belongs only to Orthodox Jews. It belongs to us too, and we have work to do interpreting and reinterpreting it. After that, the engagement must include a return to the calendar and its celebrations, with a more realistic acknowledgement of what the holidays were and are, and a more imaginative effort to accept and adapt them. And it also has to include some creative adaptation of the ways in which religion marks the life cycle. It has to include a new commitment to the Jewish past and a readiness to move beyond the people that dwells apart and give us our rightful place in global history. It has to include a retelling of that history in a critical mode, which acknowledges and rejects the subordination of women, and which also recognizes the role of women in ensuring Jewish survival despite their exclusion from public activity. It has to include a close analysis of the remarkable achievement of Jewish politics in exile to sustain for almost 2,000 years, as no other people has done, a national existence without sovereignty or territory, and to that end, to collect taxes, provide welfare services, underwrite schools, and organize a kind of self-government. It has to include a search for the experiential and textual sources of our solidarity. It has to include a recovery of the justice tradition in Jewish texts and in Jewish experience in its full complexity without shirking the question, justice for whom? And finally, it has to bring American Jewish leftists into a stronger connection with Israeli leftists, if not through Aliyah, then through what Shlomo Avineri has called Chetzi Aliyah, that is, many visits, professional collaborations, investments of time, energy, and money, so that we are engaged together in an originally religious project which we can rightly secularize and appropriate to make Israel a light unto the nations. Not the light, just one of the lights. There's nothing of chosenness or exclusivity here. Let there be many lights. The aim of our work is only that Israel one day will be one among them. All this together would give us the foundation for a Jewish leftism that might be strong enough and attractive enough to pass on to our grandchildren. Thank you.
Yes, Koya, are you willing to take some questions?
Sure.
Would you like to do it sitting down, or?
No, I'll do it from here.
Okay. Thank you so much. Professor Walzer has graciously agreed to take questions. We're going to use the same procedures. Please line up on both sides of the hall, and we'll take them in alternating manner. And we will begin on the right, if that's okay. Over here.
I agree with what you... Give him a mic.
I agree with some of what you've said, but a lot of it is not with my 85 years of experience. I've been to the Soviet Union 6 times since 1962. There's a revival now of Judaism in the Soviet Union. People know that they're Jews. A lot of the revival has been of a religious kind. The other thing is that I think Jews have a rich tradition, as you said, in the Bible. The fact that the Bible says that you should put aside part of your field to feed the poor is the origin of tzedakah. Also, the population of the left is not increasing, it's decreasing because there has been the case of the intermarried. Judaism.
Thank you. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I agree. There is much more in the tradition that supports a left perspective than I talked about today. I've written about it in other places, but there's also a lot of work to do on the tradition if it is actually to support a left politics today. And the corners of the field are an interesting case because the Bible does say you must leave the corners unharvested. It doesn't tell us how big a corner is supposed to be. You can cut corners, as we all know. The rabbis later tried to figure out how to define a proper quarter, and the argument over what percentage of our wealth should be available to the community is an argument that we still have to engage in.
Professor Walzer, it was an intriguing and very interesting talk. I have one question. There's this implicit assumption between being Jewish and being on the left. And I don't think you explain why that would be the case. Do you believe that is the case? That's just naturally the case?
No. No, I think Jewish leftism was a creation of post-emancipation Jews who were often in conflict with everything that Judaism, the Jewish life had been before emancipation. And I think that that's not a conflict that is over. I think it's not difficult to explain the voting patterns of most Jewish populations in the West, in democratic countries. We have supported the people who support us. We have supported the people who believe in and work for pluralism and toleration and liberalism and an open society in which we can live comfortably. And that is certainly the right thing to do, and it is sociologically the natural thing to do. But there is a lot in Jewish life that militates against that kind of politics.
Historically, but do you think that's still true now?
Well, we listened this morning to a discussion of Jews moving rightward in Israel, in France, not yet visibly in the United States. I've greatly enjoyed the spectacle of listening to Jewish neoconservatives telling us that very soon the Jews would begin to vote the way their income suggests they should vote. We persist in voting against the logic of our incomes, and that is much to our credit, though I think it also it does have a source in our experience of persecution. And whether my purpose speaking today was to suggest that we need to provide a stronger basis, given that most of us have not experienced persecution in this country. We need to provide a better basis for a leftism that we can pass on.
I was just going to briefly comment and ask you a question in relation to what some of the other folks have asked. You seem to correlate leftism with an adjustment to Jews to contemporary modernity and all that that means. Why is that leftism, and what is adjustment to modernity not considered here? I'm
not sure I understand the question. I think that there are many ways of adjusting to modernity. I think if you study Jewish orthodoxy and ultra-orthodoxy in the 19th century and Islamism today, and Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, and these are all adjustments to modernity. They are not; these are not versions of a traditional religion. These are modernized, politicized, ideological versions of religion. They are modern versions of religion. They not only use all the technologies of modernity, but they have the style, the political and organizational style of modernity. So there are religious, there are secular, there are right-wing and left-wing and centrist adjustments to modernity. A left-wing modernity is marked above all by a commitment to equality and democracy. And those are the commitments that mark the traditional left, and that, in my view, should mark the contemporary left. That means opposition to all forms of authoritarianism and all forms of hierarchy. It means a commitment to creating a society where the arrogance of the few and the humiliations of the many are overcome.
Okay. I'm wondering what role, if any, you think that the Jewish emphasis on Talmud study throughout the history of the Exodus might have, both in terms of obviously Jewish critical tendency to critical thinking and possibly leftist politics.
Right. I came very late in my life to Talmud study. In preparing the volumes of the Jewish political tradition, which is an anthology of texts with commentaries. I spent many years now, the last 20 years, studying Talmudic texts and medieval responsa with people who learned those texts in Israeli yeshivot, and then at some point broke with the yeshiva, with the politics of the yeshiva, and without ceasing to be religious Jews. So I studied Talmud with them, and certainly the respect for learning is an important part of Jewish culture, and I guess we all used to think that learned people would be leftists, but I'm not sure that has turned out to be right either. There is one feature that I didn't know before I began studying these texts, and that is the commitment of the rabbis from very early on to preserve dissenting opinions, as we now do with Supreme Court dissents. But this is from very early on, and it made for a remarkably argumentative culture, and that I think does help the left.
Thank you. It's great to see you today. I didn't personally cut my teeth on Irving Howe and Michael Harrington, but I'm certainly an admirer of all that work. My struggle is I feel like our community, broadly speaking, not any reference to the left, has stagnated and is almost perhaps going backwards, and particularly with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And since I don't do theory myself very well, I struggle at it, but can you offer insights to how we might go forward? And because I feel like on one level anti-Semitism is used as a weapon. I don't want to negate the reality of anti-Semitism, but there's much more anti-Semitism, of course, from Christians, and historically relatively little from Muslims. Can you offer some guidance for struggle around this, because it seems to me it's our big struggle?
Well, it wasn't my subject today. We are all engaged in, even if vicariously and at a distance, both the Arab-Israeli and the Israeli-Palestinian political conflict. We can't escape it, even though it isn't literally ours, because the critical decisions have to be made by the citizens of Israel and of Palestine. And right now, those decisions don't look like the right decisions from either side. And so I think that American Jews should be, first of all, informing themselves about this conflict, and then choosing sides and helping, I would say, helping those forces in Israel who are strong but not dominant now, helping those forces in Israel who are committed to the establishment of a Jewish state on our side of the Green Line, which will be a democratic state, and Jewish in the way that Norway is Norwegian. It will be an expression of Jewish nationhood, not of Jewish religion. And it will guarantee to all its citizens, as Norway guarantees to the Lapps in the north, who were once quite brutally discriminated against, it will guarantee to all its citizens equal rights, political rights, and equal opportunities in the economy. That's the state we should want to create, to help create. It won't be our creation, but we can help the people who are trying to build it, and we should do that.
You take one last question, is that okay?
Ezra? I just have I think it was your quotation of Milosz was a little bit unfair. I mean, Milosz was describing the highly Apollinized, integrated, acculturated, assimilated communist Jews whom he may have encountered. That is Jews on the left, but that is not the Jewish left. And the distinction has to, there was a Jewish left in Poland which was made up of hundreds of thousands of Jews who knew very well who they were and where they came from. And they were very proud Jews. I don't have to say this to this audience, but I think it's unfair to quote Milosz's description of a few Polonized Jewish communists to stand for the phenomenon of the Jewish left. It's certainly not true in Poland, and it was not true in America, where there was a huge Jewish left, Yiddish-speaking, and well-versed, some of them anyway, in Jewish history and even in Jewish tradition. It was a Jewish world, and it was not an alienated Jewish world, I think. Yeah. So this is my context.
Right, right. I actually, when I was reading the paper, I thought that you were going to make that comment. And you are right. Certainly, there was a Jewish left. Many of those Jewish leftists were involved in YIVO. But all of us know many Jewish leftists who fit that description.
Thank you. On behalf of the YIVO and of the American Jewish Historical Society, my thanks to Michael Walzer, my thanks to all of you. We continue tomorrow morning bright and early, and I hope to see many of you then.